The Garden of Eden, the Untold Story. Listen closely, for this is a story not many will tell. Not because it is secret, no. It was written down a very long time ago, in plain words, in the oldest book in the world. But some stories sit in plain sight, the way a door sits in plain sight, and we pass it every day without ever asking what is behind it. Tonight, we open the door. Sit close. Let the fire do what fires have always done. Push back the dark, just enough. Because what I am about to tell you does not begin in our time. It does not begin in your grandmother's time, nor her grandmother's before her. It begins before time had a name. It begins at the very moment when the God who made the stars felt a longing. And the longing was this: I want someone to talk to. Part 1. The garden that was never just a garden. Now, before this story can go anywhere, I must tell you something that most people have never been told. Because if you miss this, you will miss everything that follows. When the ancient writers spoke of the Garden of Eden, they were not writing about a farm. They were not describing a plot of land where a man went to plant groundnuts and watch the rain come in from the east. What they were describing was a temple, a holy place, a meeting place, the kind of place where heaven bends low and touches the earth, and neither heaven nor earth is ever the same again. You see, in the language of those ancient writers, when they spoke of a garden, when they spoke of the mountain of the Lord, when they spoke of the hill of the Most High, they were clothing one truth in many words. And the truth was this: a place where God and man could sit together. Eden was that place. Picture it now, not with your farmer's eyes. Do not picture rows of crops in hard soil. Picture instead a presence, a warmth. The kind that settles into your chest, the way this fire settles into your skin right now, without asking permission, without announcing itself. You simply feel it. You feel that you are not alone, and that being not alone is the most wonderful thing you have ever experienced. That was Eden. The prophet Ezekiel, a man who saw things in the spirit that would undo your sleep if I described them all tonight, he looked back across the ages at this garden and called it something that should make everyone go quiet. You were in Eden, the garden of God. The garden of God, not the garden of Adam, not the garden of creation, not even the garden of paradise, the garden of God. It was his. He planted it. He fashioned it the way an elder fashions a meeting place, with intention, with love, with a chair already set aside for someone he is expecting. And the prophet Isaiah, another man who saw far, described it as a place of joy and gladness, of thanksgiving and the voice of melody. A place where the wilderness becomes like Eden, where the desert becomes like the garden of God. Do you feel what these men were saying? They were saying that Eden was not a location. It was an atmosphere. It was the atmosphere that exists wherever God is, fully, warmly, presently, among his people. Part 2. The first priest in the first temple. Like a grandfather passing down something that must not be lost. And into this garden, into this sacred, holy atmosphere of the Most High, God placed a man. You know his name, Adam. But do not say that name quickly and move on. Sit with it a moment. Because this man was not placed there the way you put a guard at a gate to stand and wait for something to happen. He was not an afterthought. He was not decoration. He was placed in that garden with an assignment so weighty, so full of meaning, that the whole of human history is still shaped by it. The ancient Hebrew text tells us what God said to him. 2 words. Just 2. But hear them. Really hear them. Abad and Shama. The teachers will tell you, tend the garden, keep the garden. But those translations are the door, not the room behind the door. Because Abad does not mean to farm, and Shama does not mean to rake leaves. Abad means to worship, to serve, to minister before a holy presence. Shama means to observe an ordinance, to guard something sacred, to attend to what is holy with your full attention. These are not words you give to a farmer. These are words you give to a priest. Do you feel what I am telling you? Adam was not in a garden. He was in a temple. And his assignment was not agriculture. It was worship. It was communion. It was standing before the face of the living God and saying, with his very presence, I am here. I am yours. Speak, and I will listen. He was the very first priest the world had ever seen, and the temple he served in was Eden itself. Later, much later, when God appointed Aaron and his sons to serve in the tabernacle in the wilderness, the words he used for their assignment were the same words he had used for Adam, that he may minister unto me. The same words, crossing 1,000 years, because the assignment had never changed. And the first duty of this priest, listen carefully, was not toward the people. There were no people yet. There was no sickness to heal, no war to stop, no broken family to mend. The first duty of the priest was toward God, to sit with him, to speak with him, to love him. Every morning in those ancient temples, the priest would rise before the city woke. He would go to the altar in the half dark, and the first thing he did, before any sacrifice, before any proclamation, before any petition, was to clear the ashes from the fire of the day before. Not to perform, not to be seen, just to make room. Clearing the ashes, making space for new fire. That, the teachers say, is what prayer has always been, at its truest, at its most ancient. Not a list of problems shouted toward the sky, but a person, rising in the quiet, before the world has had a chance to fill them up with noise, and simply saying, I came to sit with you today. I do not want anything. I just came to be here. That is what God wanted from Adam in the garden, a son who would come every morning, not for need, for love. And it is what he still wants from you, tonight, by this fire, in whatever life has brought you to. Part 3. The river that was meant to cover the world. Build wonder here. This is the grand vision. Voice should feel like the horizon opening. But now, and this is where the story deepens, where it opens like a valley you did not know was there, God was not finished with his plan, because Eden was a beginning, not a destination. Out beyond the garden, beyond the sacred meeting place, beyond the presence and the warmth, there was a whole wide earth. Hills still dark with the newness of creation. Rivers that had never heard the name of God spoken over them. Villages, if we can imagine them, where no fire had ever been lit in honor of the Most High. God looked at all of it. He looked at the whole sleeping, waiting, watching world, and he had a plan. The river told the story. The ancient text says that a river went out of Eden. One river, arising from the presence of God in that sacred place, and then it divided into 4 great arms, 4 tributaries reaching outward in 4 directions, flowing toward the far ends of the known world. Now, why would God do that? Why would the river flow out? Why not stay in the garden? Because the presence that filled Eden was never meant to stay in Eden. The garden was the seed, the world was the soil. And God's plan, encoded quietly in that river like a letter folded inside a letter, was that the life, the glory, the sacred warmth of Eden would flow outward, steadily, gently, unstoppably, like water finding its way through rock, through sand, through every hard and resistant thing, outward and outward and outward, until there was nowhere left that was not touched, until the whole earth was one great garden of God. This is what the prophet Isaiah saw centuries later, when he looked into the deep sky of the future and cried out in a voice that shook the walls of heaven, "The earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." As the waters cover the sea. Have you stood at the ocean? Have you looked out past where your eyes can reach and tried to find a dry place? There is no dry place. The water does not negotiate. It does not leave patches. It covers everything, all the way to the edge, all the way down. That is what God wanted his presence to do to the earth, to cover everything, leave nothing dry. And Adam, that first priest in that first temple, was meant to be the starting point. He was to tend the garden, commune with God, grow in his priesthood, and then carry the atmosphere of Eden with him as he moved through the earth, through his children, through the people God would breathe into being through him. Slowly, steadily, like 4 rivers flowing to the 4 corners of the world, until every hill and valley and shoreline and desert was Eden. Part 4. when the river stopped, the way an elder speaks of something lost. But then Adam fell. I will not stand long in this darkness. It is not where our story ends. But I must tell you what happened, so that what comes after makes the sense it deserves. When Adam turned away from God, when he chose his own understanding over the voice of the one who had breathed him into being, something broke. Not the sky, not the mountains, something in the invisible world, something in the space between a father and a son. The priest left the temple, and the river stopped. The presence that was meant to cover the whole earth remained locked in one garden, and then even that was closed. The door was shut. Adam was sent out into the wide, unwatered world, and the earth stayed dry. But here, hold on to this. This is the ember in the cold. God did not change his mind. He is not a man who changes when things go wrong. The scripture says plainly, I am the Lord, I change not. What he wanted from the beginning is what he wanted still. And so he began again. After Adam, Noah. When the flood swept the earth clean and the waters finally drew back, God stood over Noah and his shivering family and spoke the same words he had spoken to Adam in the garden. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. The same commission, the same charge, a new man carrying an ancient river. And Noah, before he built a house for himself, built an altar. He knew, or he felt it in his bones, the way you feel a truth you cannot yet speak. The assignment was never only about children. It was about carrying the meeting place of God wherever you went. It was about making every new place a garden. After Noah, Abraham. God zeroed in on one quiet, wandering man in a world that had forgotten him, and he leaned close and whispered a promise that would reach across all time. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you, and through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And everywhere that wandering father went, every strange land, every foreign hillside, every unfamiliar valley, he stopped. He built an altar. He called on the name of the Lord. He planted a meeting place between heaven and earth in the soil of wherever he was. As if to say, the presence of God has arrived here. This place is now Eden. Isaac did the same. Jacob did the same, sleeping on bare ground at Bethel, waking with fire in his eyes, setting a stone upright and crying out, surely God is in this place. This is the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Generation after generation, altar after altar, the same river trying to find its way to the sea. Then Moses, carrying those wandering millions through the wilderness, built a tabernacle, a physical, portable, beautiful house for the presence of God. And as the people traveled, through heat and dust and complaint and doubt, they carried it with them. The dwelling place of God moved with them, because the presence of God was never meant to stay in one place. It was always meant to travel, to flow, like a river toward the sea. Part 5. The Man Who Became the Temple. Voice should feel like something long awaited has finally arrived. And then, after all of that, after all the altars, after all the prophets, after all the tabernacles carried through all the deserts of all the years, he came. A child was born, and they called him Emmanuel. Do you know what that name means? Not the way we say it quickly in our songs and then move on. Hear it slowly. Feel its weight. God has set up his tent among us. The word became flesh, and the old word the writer used when he said, dwelt among us, it does not mean simply lived. It means tabernacled. He pitched his tent in the middle of our camp. After Eden, after the flood, after all the wandering and all the altars and all the temples that men built with hands that eventually grew tired, God did what only God could do. He became the temple himself. Jesus walked into the great physical temple in Jerusalem, that towering, magnificent building of stone and cedar and gold that took decades to build. And he said something that made the air in the room go still. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They did not understand him, but the writer tells us what he meant. He was speaking of the temple of his own body. The river had found its source again, not in a garden, not in a mountain, not in a building made with hands, in a person. The presence of God was walking among us in sandals. But even that was not the end, because Jesus also called himself the cornerstone, the foundation stone, the first and chief stone from which every other stone takes its direction. In the old way of building, the cornerstone was not the whole house. It was the beginning of the house, the one solid place from which everything else was measured, angled, and raised. Jesus did not come to be the only temple. He came to be the first stone of a temple that would never stop growing. Part 6. You are the river. This is the crescendo and the charge. Let it swell slowly, then bring it all the way down for the close. Are you hearing this? From Adam in the garden, to Noah on the mountain, to Abraham at his altar, to Moses in the wilderness, to David's longing, to Solomon's temple, to the prophets who looked from afar and saw a glory that was still coming. All of it, every altar, every tabernacle, every river and every stone and every generation that carried the presence of God through the dark, all of it was pointing to this, the church, living temples, walking Edens, the river that was always meant to flow. The moment you believed, the moment you opened your heart and said yes to the one who had been standing at the door longer than you knew, something was laid. A stone was set in place. You became part of the temple. You became a carrier of the presence. You became the river. The Apostle Peter wrote it plainly. A man who once stood in a rocking boat and felt the water pull at his knees as he reached for Jesus. You are living stones, being built up into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. Living stones, not finished ones, not polished, placed, done. Living, still being moved, still being fitted, part of a building that is not yet complete, that is still rising, even now, even tonight, one saved soul at a time. Every person who comes to faith, in your city, in a village you have never visited, in a country whose name you cannot pronounce, is another stone. The temple grows. The river spreads. Until, as the scripture promises, the kingdoms of this world shall become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ. But now, before we rise from this fire, there is one thing the teachers want you to carry with you into the morning. A river cannot flow from a dry place. You cannot carry the presence of God to your street, to your family, to the stranger whose face holds a weight you recognize but cannot name, if you have never sat long enough in his presence to be filled by it yourself. This was Adam's first assignment. Not to go out. First, to be in the garden, to worship, to commune, to let the presence of God settle into him the way water settles into dry ground, slowly, quietly, until there is no dry place left inside. And then, only then, to go. And wherever he went, Eden would go with him. The fire is lower now. The night has been patient with us. And perhaps you are sitting here asking, what does this mean for me? Here, in this body, in this time, with this ordinary, complicated, sometimes broken life. It means everything. It means the God who built a garden just so he would have somewhere to walk with man is still walking, still looking across the evening of your life to find you, still listening for the sound of your voice the way he listened for Adam's in the cool of the day. It means that your first calling, before any title, before any ministry, before any gift is named or any assignment is handed out, is the same calling given to the very first human being who ever took a breath. Come, sit, be with me. And it means that wherever you go when you rise from this place, to your home, to your work, to your children, to the person whose eyes carry something they have never told anyone, you carry something with you. You carry the river. And the river was always supposed to flow. And that was the moment I understood that the Garden of Eden was never just a place on a map. It was a picture of what God has always wanted. A world so full of his presence that everywhere you look, you find him.